Welcome, everyone. Welcome to On the Park Bench, a public square conversation brought to you by Congress for the New Urbanism. On the Park Bench presents interactive conversations with thought leaders in new urbanism and allied industries, providing an opportunity for the audience to engage in real time. The webinar series is a platform for CNU members to engage, debate, and collaborate on pressing issues of the day. Today's webinar is Authors Forum, Sustainable Urban Design Handbook with author Nico Larco. You can share your thoughts on hashtag on the park bench at tinyurl.com/OTPBfeedback. And be sure to join us for upcoming On the Park Bench webinars. Next Tuesday, August 27th, join us for Authors Forum, Building an Affordable House. Author Fernando Pajes Ruiz will discuss the second edition of his book, Building an Affordable House. The book adds his impressive new urbanist development and planning knowledge to the most comprehensive and honest discussion of affordable housing construction issues. You can register at cnu.org/resources/ontheparkbench. And be sure to join or renew your CNU membership, get connected to a powerful movement to advance walkable urbanism, and get the resources and tools to effect change, as well as sharpen your skills in the architecture of community. Navigate to cnu.org and select our member portal. And now for today's webinar. Nico Larco is an urban designer, architect, and professor. He leads Element Urban Design, a design and consulting firm, and has been a professor of architecture and urban design at the University of Oregon since 2004, where he is also the director of the Urbanism Next Center and co-director of the Sustainable Cities Institute. Since 2018, he has also been a strategic advisor and researcher at TNO, a Dutch national think tank. Professor Larco researches and teaches sustainable urban design, has developed the Sustainable Urban Design Framework, and is the lead author on Sustainable Urban Design Handbook, published in 2004. He assists cities and projects on how best to apply these principles and approaches. His work around Urbanism Next is focused on how technological advances such as shared mobility, self-driving cars, e-commerce, and the sharing economy are changing city form and development. Professor Larco assists cities and projects in future-proofing to thrive amidst these advances, has run workshops and charrettes nationally and internationally on this topic, and has coordinated work in this area with various municipal and state agencies across North America and in Europe. Professor Larco has published in various academic and professional journals, and his work has been covered by Wired, the New York Times, Fast Company, Bloomberg News, Forbes, the Financial Times of London, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. He's a Fulbright Scholar in 2012-2013 in Spain at the Polytechnic University of Catalonia and at the University of Navarra, a visiting professor at TU Delft in 2018-2019, and was a Fulbright Scholar in 2019 at the Pontificia Universidad Católica in Chile. He has testified on his research to the U.S. Congress, has worked on research for the European Commission, and was a speaker at TEDx College Park. And I'm Lauren Mayer, Associate Director of Resources at CNU. As a reminder, please use the Q&A function to ask questions as they occur to you. Let's go ahead and start today's webinar. Nico, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. So excited to be here. I'm going to give me a second here to share my screen. There. And can you confirm that you can see that?
Yes, all good.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Lauren. Really appreciate the invitation to be here and the introduction. Very excited to be talking to all of you. As Lauren mentioned, my name is Nico Larco. I'm a professor at University of Oregon, and I direct the Urbanism Next Center and co-direct the Sustainable Cities Institute. I'm very excited to be talking today about some work that I've been working on for more than a decade now on how it is we think about sustainable urban design. I'm going to present to you a framework and then also introduce you to a resource that we've recently published about this. So as a way of starting out, I realize now that I can actually see the chat as I'm doing this, but maybe just as a thought experiment, for each of you to think a little bit about how you currently approach sustainable urban design in projects. And this is a question I've asked many people, many different design planning firms, community groups. What is it you think about? How do you organize what you're going to be, taking on, and how you're going to be thinking about it? So maybe we'll just let you think about that. And the impetus for a lot of this work is to kind of try to answer that question of how do we do sustainable urban design, right? This came a lot out of looking at many different types of places and asking the question of like, is this place sustainable, or how do I make it sustainable? Which you realize is a tremendously complicated question. There's lots of different types of places all over the globe. This on the top here is Shanghai, then Arizona, and on the bottom is Libreville in Gabon. And you can ask the question of, is this sustainable for all these? And you have really different answers in terms of what might be possible. There's obviously different environmental contexts, right? Climate context, but there's also really different contexts in terms of the culture of the place, the lifestyles of the place, the economies of the place, the political will. And so if we really want to move the dial on sustainability, we have to, on the one hand, understand what it means to be sustainable, the complicated parts of this question of, is this sustainable? And then figure out how we move the dial wherever possible, however possible, wherever possible, right? Which has different answers in these different contexts. Sustainability has a lot in urban design. As we all know, urban design is a very complicated field, and there's all these different pieces of it. It's really important to define what sustainability is so that we know what it is we need to focus on, what it is that needs to be done in any given project, how we might compare and evaluate different schemes or different areas, and also to shed light on false claims. So here you can see images of a lot of what's traditionally considered a part of sustainability, everything from obviously the transportation network to ecology and habitat issues, stormwater issues. But then we also have things, one of the things that stuck out to me a lot as we were starting a lot of this research is just how much oftentimes when we talk about sustainability at the urban design scale, you would see things like, photovoltaics, which is a fantastic thing that we should be doing, absolutely. But that is more of an architectural question, right? There is some work in urban design thinking about solar kind of how you're organized in terms of solar access, but it's mostly an architectural question. So trying to figure out like, what are the questions we should be asking in urban design? Well, it turns out there's a ton of different work that's been doing that, fantastic work that touches on these topics, right? And it ranges from a bunch of different disciplines. So everything from kind of street design to urban forestry, ecology, stormwater management. There's just a ton of different, we'll say, places that have started to look at this. The problem is that most of these are tremendously siloed. And so the problem is that most of us don't know about these other parts. And then what's lacking is some kind of idea of how these things overlap with each other, how decisions in one area might affect decisions in another area. There might be opportunities, synergies, co-benefits within some of these, or there might be trade-offs that we need to be considered. So a lot of the work that I've been doing is really trying to pull from all this and figure out a way that we can put it all together and understand it. Now, some of the systems that exist is, I asked the question of how you might approach sustainability in urban design. I'm guessing some of you were thinking of some of the rating systems that exist, which have been really good systems, I'll say, or really good steps forward in thinking about sustainability in urban design. There's LEED, cities and communities being the kind of the most recent part of it, I'll say. Sites, which is more landscape oriented, DGNB and BREEAM are mostly used in Europe. Some issues with this are with these systems, though, as you think about them as design tools or community engagement tools, is they get really technical really fast. So they are they're often, I think, of ways of fine tuning a design or ways of evaluating if a design is working, but they're not fantastic design tools. And I'd be hard pressed oftentimes to use some of these tools in stakeholder engagement, as they get really complicated much quicker, I think, than is helpful. They also range in terms of what types of things they're looking at. BREEAM, for instance, talks about good governance, not only how it is, the physical design aspect. So really honing in on the physical design aspects is difficult, and I would say is lacking a clear system. So from all this, all these motivations and background research, the idea was try to understand, how do we get our arms around this topic of sustainable urban design? What are the things we should be looking at? And from the research that I was talking about, and a large number of interviews in a range of different fields, distilled it down to these 5 main parts. The first one is energy use and greenhouse gas based on transportation and land use. And new urbanism this is not a surprise to many people who are new urbanists, right? This idea of how we get people out of cars and into bike, ped, transit. A whole lot of work done in that. The next one is water, which is mostly stormwater issues in urban design is what we deal with. We somewhat deal with potable water, but mostly stormwater issues. When water falls from the sky, what happens to it? How do we deal with that? Ecology and habitat, fairly straightforward, thinking about the natural environment that exists around us and the opportunities for supporting species in that and natural cycles. Energy use and production is purposefully separated far away from energy use and greenhouse gas and transportation and land use, because these are often put together, but they're really different issues, right? The energy use and greenhouse gas with transportation and land use really is about the organization of the city overall to get people, as I mentioned, out of cars and into bike, ped, transit. Energy use and production is really about, for non-transportation issues, is things like embodied energy of a city, how it is that the way that we're developing, how much embodied energy is in those development models, things like creating micro climates, and things like mitigating the urban heat element effect. The last one is equity and health, which really deals with things such as affordability, accessibility, physical activity, how much you're moving around, safety, and then social mobility, how it is we can get out of whatever economic situation we're in into a better economic situation, and how much the built environment kind of impacts that. So these 5 major, I call these outcome goals, are kind of guide most of what we want to do in sustainable urban design. So with that, what it is actually separated out into these 4 scales, and these should feel somewhat or reminiscent for those of you who are in work a lot with new urbanism. Region and city, large kind of scales. District, neighborhood, where we have a lot of urban design projects tend to sit. And then a difference here compared to some of the work that's done with the charter is this separation into block and street and project parcel. And these are basically the same scale, but they're differentiating that block and street is typically the public realm and project parcel is typically the private sector realm. This is not always the case. Obviously, if you think about large campuses or something like that, right? These things kind of blur. But what this does is it gives you this overview of the outcome goals that we're looking towards, and then the different scales at which we might work. From that, then I developed organized all these specific physical urban design elements, physical things that you can do with the city into each one of these within this matrix. And I will put a link in the chat as soon as we're done with the presentation, which sends you to this framework. But what this does is it helps you understand kind of that gets your arms around the entire topic of sustainability and urban design. And you can do a bunch of different things with this. On the one hand, if you have a project, for instance, at this scale, this gives you a checklist of things that you should be paying attention to, right? What kinds of questions you should be asking in the design. If you have a certain outcome goal that you're really focused on, well, these are all the things that need to happen at the different scales to get to that outcome goal. So you can use this, for instance, as a design tool. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but you can use this as a design tool. You can use this as a evaluation tool, right? How are we doing with each one of these topics in an area? You can use this as a stakeholder engagement tool, right? Stakeholders typically know very well the things that the outcomes that they want, those pieces on the left-hand side. Well, this is, and I say this all the time, a magic decoder ring, right? That lets you understand, well, here's the physical things you need to do to be able to get to that outcome goal, right? So this kind of organizes the whole piece. So what I'm going to do now is go briefly and fairly quickly through each one of these different outcome goal categories to give you a sense of how this is organized and how you might use it. So if we look at energy use based on greenhouse gas, energy use and greenhouse gas based on transportation and land use, as I mentioned before, the main idea is how do we get people out of cars and into bike, ped, transit, right? And there's a whole range of things that we can be doing. At the largest scale, at the region and city scale, we're talking about things like compact development, super important. No surprise to a new urbanist. More compact development reduces the distance between different destinations and allows much more mixture of uses. Fantastic, right? With that, though, at this scale, we're also talking about robust transit networks, robust bicycle networks, right? Really important at the largest scale. Balanced vehicular networks. We do still need cars, but that doesn't mean that they need to dominate everything. And then for the land use, this regional land use mix, making sure that we don't have all of our residential in one part of the city, all of our industrial in another part of the city, right? That we're mixing these things all together. At the next scale, at the district and neighborhood scale, we can think of a couple of different things. One of the big ones is thinking about our pedestrian networks and how that's created through small and defined blocks and street network connectivity. So the image on the left here, this is downtown Portland, which we are famous for our 200 by 200 foot grid, very, very small grid, which makes the city feel tremendously walkable, really easy to get from any one place to another place in a fairly direct path. This is more or less anywhere. We've seen this pattern all over the country. These kind of loops and lollipops and serpentine roads, where if I live, for instance, here and I want to get to a friend who lives there, instead of having this, fairly straightforward short distance, I need to do this large roundabout going out here, probably hitting an arterial, coming back, and then going to that. Which can more than double the distance that you need to travel, which means that we will all do what we typically, a rational decision, which is, well, okay, why don't you ask your kids to get in the car to take them to see that friend, as opposed to be able to walk to those locations. So really important pedestrian, how we have our block structured makes really big difference. These same kind of at this scale, we also think about things like our high density zoning and platting, right? So what's the size of our lots? What kinds of buildings can we make? How much density can we put in there? What kind of zoning is allowing that? And those types of things. And then we can also think at the same scale about how we're doing the mixed land use at the district scale. So this is more thinking about the 15-minute city. Do we have a range of uses where I can get to most anything I need to get to in 80% of my needs are fulfilled within a walking distance or short biking distance. At the block and street scale, we're thinking about things like complete streets. Again, will be no surprise to people working in new urbanism. So multimodal street design, thinking about pedestrian-friendly streets, bicycle-friendly streets, transit-friendly streets, and streets that allow the car but are not dominated by the car. This is an image from NACTO's Urban Street Design Guide. If you were not familiar with that publication, it is fantastic, has great resources, a great resource for how to design streets. And we worked with NACTO on this work in the book that I'll be talking about in just a little bit. But the idea is that all these different modes have a place, designated space, right? One does not dominate or create problems for the other. So figuring out how you integrate all those different pieces. Also, at the same scale, we can think about things such as parking, which on the one hand is, how do we organize parking in terms of, is it district parking, such as the image that you see on the left, where there's a parking garage that feeds a whole district, or we have on-site parking, which is the image that you see on the right, which causes a lot of, takes up a lot of space, and then also it needs to be it isn't used throughout the day in quite as rigorous a way. So how it is that we organize our parking, and then how we actually design the parking. So how does the parking touch the street? Is there an edge condition that defines the edge of the street, or does it bleed into the parking? What kinds of uses might we put on a ground floor and put parking behind? Do we put parking on corner lots or within the block? What's the extent of the parking along the block, or can that be more internalized, right? So those kind of design decisions make a big difference on if you decide to walk or bike or use transit. And then finally, in this category, looking at the project parcel scale, a whole lot of questions on how it is that the buildings are supporting the sustainability at the urban scale. So one of the questions, which again should be of no surprise, is this idea of like entrances and transparency. The image on the left is a project which has, you can see behind there's tall towers that this project is attached to. But instead of having all the circulation be internal, each one of these units is actually a townhome, which looks directly out on the street, connects directly onto the street. So there's entrances and there's transparency. You can see it on the right-hand side in a commercial setting where, once again, instead of creating a blank wall there, the way that the building is fronting the street, the way that you're creating active street edges makes a tremendous difference in terms of how vibrant the street feels, and how much activity happens there and how safe it feels, right? So these are all ways that the built environment at all these different scales is helping get to that goal of getting people out of cars and into bike-ped transit, right? As I mentioned before, my sense is none of this is surprising to any of you with the work that typically happens in urbanism. If we look at stormwater, there's two main things that we want to be doing. On the one hand, we're trying to minimize the amount of runoff that exists. And the other hand, so reduce the amount of when water hits the ground, try to get it back into the ground as quickly as possible. And then the other part is we want to mitigate that runoff. So if we look at this is a slide from the EPA where you can see that in a natural state, right, there's 40% is evapotranspiration. 25% of the water that falls goes into deep infiltration, 25% shallow filtration, and you only have 10% of runoff, right, that whirls along the surface. In more urbanized settings, right, some of the things that we're really hoping for with that dense kind of development, you end up getting a much different mix. Only 5% goes into deep infiltration. This is a huge reduction of kind of aquifers being filled up, 10% shallow, and more than 5 times, 55% of the water becomes runoff, right? So this is an enormous question or problem. And most of this water is in urban areas that are not taking sustainability approaches, are taking that water and as quickly as possible putting back into natural systems. So that means that you've got a lot of fast-moving, hot, and polluted water going to the natural systems. And with sustainable systems, what you really want to do is exactly the opposite. You want to try to cool the water down, cool it off, slow it down, filter it, and put it back into the natural system as much as possible. So what are some of the things that we might do? So the first thing in terms of minimizing runoff, at the largest scale, we're talking about trying to create compact development. So this is a slide also from the EPA, which looks at this is a watershed and the option of having all dense development happening in one area versus that same amount of development spread over an entire watershed. And even though this actually creates a tremendous amount of problems for that area that is densely developed, this is actually much worse because it has a small effect everywhere. You are creating pollutants, you are creating runoff all over the larger watershed. And in fact, this helps maintain more of a natural system, and then you can mitigate the impacts that are happening there. So again, compact development being really important in trying to minimize and mitigate runoff. Other ways you can minimize runoff is simply by reducing the amount of pervious or impervious surfaces. So creating streets that are more narrow, fantastic for that. Great for pedestrian kind of issues as well, but really great for stormwater issues, creating impervious surfaces in that. And then, another thing we can do is trees. So fantastic studies out of California showing that a tree canopy itself can hold about 24% of the water that falls from the sky, and so that it never touches the ground. This is an image right after a storm event, and you can see that these tree canopies and the bark has a really big role to play in this, actually holds the water and never has it touch the ground. So huge ways, all these different ways of minimizing the amount of runoff. Then there's ways of mitigating the runoff, which I'm sure you're all familiar with as well. This idea of detention ponds, retention ponds, bioswales, rain gardens, all ways that we can, instead of putting water into pipes, moving it quickly and hot and polluted into natural waterways, these are all systems that help cool it down, slow it down, filter it, and then put it back into natural systems, be it through in larger detention ponds or slowly infiltrating each step of the way in rain gardens and such. Trees as well have a great impact on this as well, as they can provide evapotranspiration. This is where the tree is pulling water up out of the soil through its roots, up into the canopy and coming out through the leaves. There's stomata in the leaves. And this is a tremendous amount of water that can, thousands of gallons of water. A mature oak can put back thousands of gallons of water into the air in a day. And so this is a fantastic way of pulling water out of the soil and giving the soil more capacity to take on more water, right? So as mentioned with stormwater, two big things: reducing the amount of runoff and then mitigating the runoff at these different scales. In terms of ecology and habitat, there's three things that we really want to do. On the one hand, don't touch things that you shouldn't be touching. Leave critical areas undisturbed as much as possible. Where we do need to touch it, we need to figure out how we mitigate those effects or mitigate that kind of interaction. And then we also work at a scale that's large enough at urban design where we can actually create microhabitats. So what does this mean in terms of how this might work at these different scales? Well, at the largest scale, we're really talking about compact development being really good, so that we're not disturbing, we're not spreading out over the landscape, and we're leaving more land untouched. But then we're also talking about robust ecological networks. So here you can see with an urban area, this fantastic ecological network that moves throughout that area. This is an excellent place on the one hand, could be for recreation, but it's a great place for species to move from one place to another, to have large amounts of habitat, to be able to have places to forage, or places for protection or for mating, whatever might be needed. Oftentimes we think of urban areas as antithetical to ecology and habitat, but there's enormous opportunities to bring these things together, and great examples throughout the country where this has happened. As we think about these ecological corridors, there's different types of corridors. There's different sizes of corridors, different ways that species might move between these. And there's really a big difference between what is considered core habitat, the larger kind of expanses. There's some species that really only can exist within core habitat and be undisturbed or feel more protected from things outside of it. And then there's this kind of edge habitat, which happens around the core habitats, which could be between two different types of habitats, or between, for instance, habitat and developed areas. And so understanding how it is that those pieces interact, what species work best at one scale or another scale, is really, really important. This is an image here from Hammarby Solstad, where you can see this fantastic kind of buffer between the built environment that's happening on the background there, this grass, which becomes this buffer, and then these wetlands up in front. We can think about different buffers that we might need between different types of development. And this, we really need to focus on what kind of species we're most interested in. So here we're looking at the block and street scale, thinking about robust ecological area buffers from the framework. But depending on what species we're looking at, that might tell you the length or the size of the buffer that you might need. And you might need to modify that based on if there's more of a slope or more higher intensity of development in one place or another. In interviewing a lot of people working in the area of ecology, one of the things that became clear, I often ask, what's the most important thing urban designers should think about in terms of ecological resilience and robustness? And one of the topics that came back over and over again was this question of vertical complexity. And the basic idea behind that is that in many natural habitats, there is a real mix of canopy, a tall canopy, bushes, shrubs, sedges, ground cover, right? This whole range of different vertical structure. And that creates these this large variety of the types of habitat that's being created, which is really good not only for different species, but maybe different parts of the life cycle for any one species. So on the left here is, if any of you haven't been out to Oregon, this is what our natural areas look like, our rainforest that we have out here. Really beautiful, beautiful area. And you can see a tremendous amount of vertical complexity in this. And what we typically build is the thing on the right in urban areas, right? Which is this kind of monoculture of grass, and then monoculture of one kind of tree repeated, I call these lollipop trees, throughout. And it's really possible, and that makes sense in places maybe where you want to have be able to kick a ball around or throw a Frisbee, but we do so much of our open space this way, and it doesn't necessarily create opportunities for habitat in that. Here's an example where you can actually put these things, do something in between. And this is actually an area off of a parking lot that on the one hand is acting as a stormwater, a rain garden, right? So this is water coming off of the asphalt you see on the right, instead of going into a pipe, instead going into this this drainage area. where not only is that where the water can accumulate, but instead of just planting it with grass, for instance, or putting gravel in there, there's this fantastic vertical complexity. So you see there's trees, there's bushes, there's sedges, and there's ground cover. And so this creates a much more robust ecological area. And I'll also mention that as we think about ecology and habitat, some of the most important species that we really need to think about, or class of species, is insects. If insects are doing well, talk to ecologists, they always say if the insects are doing well, then everything upstream is going to be doing well from that. So really important to create habitat like this for these types of species. We also have the opportunity, as I mentioned, to create microhabitats. This is an example of a park that has both wetlands, actual water areas, wetlands, grasslands, and then kind of this oak savanna up at the top on the left there. It's a little bit of like a zoo-ish kind of look here because they're trying to put everything into one place, but it does actually work to create all these habitat. And there are many species of birds actually that inhabit this, and many species of insects. So we do have the opportunity as urban designers to create these microhabitats at the Block Street project parcel scale. We go to the next category, looking at energy use and production. And here, as I mentioned, we're really talking about not about the transportation-related energy use, but more non-transportation sources or non-transportation reasons to be using energy. This is a fairly complicated topic in that climates are very different. So in a lot of the work we've done, we've separated kind of into these four main classes of climates: hot, dry climates, hot, humid climates, cold and hot climates, temperate climates typically called, or cold climates. And we would act differently in each one of these areas. So on the one hand, we can think about what housing typologies might be best for these different climatic zones. So you can look here, we looked at these 6 main housing typologies and kind of looked at which ones make the most sense, right? How is urban design creating the opportunity for sustainability at the architectural scale? So looking at how these things might need solar exposure or access to wind, access to ventilation, these types of things. And I'll mention here as well that some of the things that this doesn't necessarily say that you shouldn't use towers anywhere, because towers might make sense in some contexts, especially if you're looking for really high density. But just understand that there's a trade-off between the benefits you might get from density and the actual climatic response, the energy use that the building scale is going to have. Also, within this energy use and production, we can think about the color of materials, so the albedo effect. So having cool and green surfaces really makes a big difference in reducing the urban heat island effect. This is a really great example from Barcelona, a street where the public realm has really been substantially greened, and it helps create a much cooler area for this. The other thing we can think about in this category is this question of embodied energy. So here you have 4 examples in going Florida. I don't remember which one the middle one is, Barcelona, and then New York. And if you think about, we often think about embodied energy at the architectural scale, right? How much energy is needed to, use a certain enclosure system, we'll say, or sorry, to mine all the materials for it, to process it, to manufacture it, to transport it, to then operate it in a building, and then how to dispose of it. Well, that same idea of embodied energy we can think of in the urban realm. So if you think about, some of the big pieces of embodied energy we have are, for instance, all of our infrastructure, our streets, our sewers, our electrical systems, these types of things. And in in New York, 100 feet of street has a certain amount of embodied energy within it, but it serves, we're talking 50, 100, 200 units. Whereas the development, low density development, suburban development, we have the similar or sometimes even more embodied energy because of the size of streets, and yet we're only serving 3, 4, 5 units. So we can think about how the overall organization of our cities having a really important effect on the embodied energy of the city. The last category here is equity and health. And in that, there's really these 5 main pieces of it that urban design affects. So on the one hand, affordability. So how is it that the transportation network, as I talked about before, the getting people out of cars and a bike ped transit isn't only good for the energy use part of this, but it's also really important for equity considerations. It affects the affordability. If I have to use a lot of my money for transportation, it actually affects how much my quality of life and my affordability overall. So thinking about our transportation network, our density, this lot sizes, lot shapes, right, can have big effect on the affordability of a place. Accessibility, all the transportation piece that I talked about before, obviously. Physical activity really talks about things like, on the one hand, the active transportation. So do I have a transportation system that has me walking and biking and using transit, which usually starts and ends with walking and biking, but also what kind of parks are available. Thinking about the district, neighborhood, and block street scale, what kind of open spaces are available. A huge indicator of if people will be physically active is how easy or hard it is for people to get to these open spaces. If it's really easy for you to get to a place that you do exercise, there's a hugely larger chance that you'll actually be doing exercise. And then what type of open space you have, and really coordinate that with the different demographics. Young kids obviously need playgrounds and some open space to run around. Teens and middle-aged adults want courts and fields to be able to run out. And then older adults want places where they can walk, and very importantly, places they can sit and stroll and watch people go by. In terms of safety, we're talking about safety from crashes. Again, a lot of the transportation work that I talked about before is really, or category is important for this, but also safety from pollutants. So where do we have our schools, for instance, in relationship to freeways and those types of things? And then social mobility, there's been a number of studies in the last decade that have shown how much the physical design of the built environment affects people's ability to get out of poverty. And, not surprisingly, affordability and accessibility have a huge piece to do with this, right? If I'm spending most of my money to get around the city, or I'm spending most of my time to get around the city, and therefore I have difficult to access jobs, education, training, services, healthcare, these types of things, that's going to really diminish my ability to improve my socioeconomic situation. So, okay. So that was very quickly going over these different pieces just as an introduction. I want to talk a little bit about how it is that you might use this. So on the one hand, as I mentioned, you can think about this in terms of focusing on your outcome goals that you're most interested in, and this understanding of like these are all the pieces that need to be in place to make that thing happen. And on the other hand, you can think about this. I've got a project at a specific scale. We're working with a community on a specific project. I want to do an evaluation at a specific scale. Well, these are all the questions that I should be asking. And you can think about, on the one hand, these are the things you should be asking about the project itself, but you can also think about, well, what situation is this other scale in, right? What's the context? What things are already working well, and what things might be a bigger lift, right? So it can be a really helpful design tool with this. It can also, using the framework can also help you understand synergies and co-benefits. So for instance, one of the questions that all urban designers run into at some point is figuring out how you deal with your trees. And most projects in most cities typically, decide on trees based on whatever happened in the block next door, and 20, 30 feet on center, and that's what we do. But you can use this framework to think about, and this approach to broader ideas of sustainable urban design to make, I'd say, more informed decisions. On the one hand, you can think about, in terms of energy use and greenhouse gas, how is it that the trees are helping create a pedestrian-friendly or bike-friendly environment, right? So everything from trees really acting as buffers between the street and the pedestrian realm, to how it is that how the trees are, in here creating this fantastic dappled light right here, which makes a beautiful kind of pedestrian environment. In terms of water, we can think about, in stormwater, we can think about what species of trees we're using, what's the canopy like, what's the bark structure like, how much water is it going to be able to hold in different types of events, how much water will it be able to evapotranspirate in those events. We can also think about ecology and habitat. We often create monocultures with street trees, which I think is a valid approach as well. But you can also think about, well, maybe instead of 20, 30 feet on center, I create clusters of these trees, and maybe I create, mix the species up within a block, which can expand the robustness and also help with a bunch of different species, right? Vary the species that are really served by the habitat. In terms of energy use and production, you can think about the location of these trees. Should they be on the east side, west side, north, south side? How close to the building should they be? Should they be deciduous or evergreen? How much shading are they going to be creating? How do they help create the microclimate in this area? Those types of things. And in terms of equity and health, you can also think about things, which is an issue in many cities, which is how allergenic are these trees? Are there certain trees create a lot of problems, health problems for people at different times of the year? What species might I choose for that? So again, this one question of like, what tree should I use and where should I put it? As you use this framework and understand all the different parts of sustainability, helps you make more sophisticated decisions around that. You can also use this to help think about trade-offs. So I showed this slide before, with this seems like an ideal situation for runoff, and this seems like a horrible situation for runoff. But conversely, this is a great situation for density and energy use and greenhouse gas, getting people out of cars and bike ped transit, as opposed to that. So this framework lets you kind of take a look at and makes evident where some of the trade-offs might be and how best to mitigate around these things, right? So you can think through the different aspects of that. So ways of using this framework, and I've mentioned a couple of these. I'll just talk a little bit more right now. So on the one hand, you can use this as a design tool. It's really what questions need to be asked of a project. So you can look through and figure out, this is a scale that we're working on. These are all the things that we need to be asking. It doesn't mean that you're going to be able to answer all those things. It doesn't mean that there's going to be the political will or economic will to work on all those things. But you could at least ask the question to figure out what kinds of things make sense to be touching upon. You can also use this to do an existing conditions evaluation or assessment. And I'll show you an example of this in just a little bit. But you could look at a site that you're about to be working on and go through each one of these topics and just ask the question, is this working well? Do we have does this have good bones so that we can actually build on this? Is this a low-hanging fruit, something that we could be improving? Is it really hard? And we really need to figure out how to mitigate the fact that we don't have that element there. So it really helps you do this kind of evaluation. You can also use it to evaluate different schemes, right? So we've got 4 different proposals for what might happen here. Which proposal is most sustainable? Well, again, complicated question. Well, let's look through the matrix. Which parts of it make the most sense, are going to be the most beneficial, and which are most painful. In terms of a client and stakeholder engagement tool, stakeholders are usually really good, as I mentioned before, in understanding what it is, the outcomes that they want, the things that they find are important. And this helps translate, which oftentimes, people who are not in the design fields don't understand how it is that, by protecting some specific species, what are all the pieces across all the different scales that need to come to play to help make that thing happen. So it's a great way of, as I mentioned, this magic decoder ring that help people understand how to translate their interest into the physical design across all these different scales. It also lets people see, like, oh, my interest is in there. Oh, but there's these other interests as well. So you can think about where there's potential benefits, co-benefits over there, and also just the understanding that there's other issues that are important if we think about sustainability. And finally, you can talk about kind of design team composition with this. So we've done this with a couple of different firms where you go through your office and just ask people to rate themselves on, this is a topic I know each one of these elements in the framework. This is a topic I know really well. This is a topic that I kind of know, and this is a topic I know nothing about. One of the difficulties with sustainable urban design is that it covers a range of different topics, and it's hard. Most people don't know everything, right? And so figuring out how you balance a team to make sure that you're covering those things. So it can help you figure out how you create a design or planning team or project team on these things. It could also help you understand where you might need training and where you need to beef up the expertise in your office. Or it can also help you understand who the next person you should hire, right? And what kinds of skills you might be looking for that. So to give you just a quick example of how you might use this framework, this is a project that we did. This is my goodness, I'm forgetting the name of this. The Lloyd District. in Portland. So for those of you who are familiar with Portland, what you see there on the lower left-hand side is downtown. Up here, there's a now really defunct mall that's with a new owner. This is the convention center, and this is where the Blazers play. And the owners of the new owners of the mall were thinking about how to redo this area, and we took them on as clients along with the city at the same time to say, well, what could happen here? What might we do here? And the question of like, how do we make this more sustainable? So we did an evaluation where we looked at all the different elements and just quickly went through and said, well, these things work well. Already you're in good shape, or there's these things are likely, or you could be doing something, and these things are all might be hard to lift. So you got to figure out how it is you can what you might be able to do to mitigate that, or bring in partners to make that work. And you can do this at all the different scales. So we kind of went scale by scale talking about this, which lets the planning, design, development team understand what's possible, what's easy, what's hard, and what some approaches might be to this. So over the last 10 years, I've been working on developing that framework into a book that just recently got published just a few months ago called the Sustainable Urban Design Handbook. And I developed this with Karin Knudsen, an urban designer, architect, who is now, interestingly, about to be the mayor-elect of the city of Eugene. And what the book does, it takes all the elements that are in the framework, and there's a chapter for each element. I'm going to show you basically how the chapters are organized to give you a sense of how it works. So each one of the elements that you saw in the framework have have its own chapter where it talks about what the thing is, has a brief description, what the element description, because some of these things are topics that you might not be familiar with. Talks briefly about what metrics are most important here. Has a section, we call this the dashboard here, this page, a section that talks about how this element is related to other urban design elements. And this is one of the parts that I'm most proud of within the book. It talks about how this element is influenced by other elements and how it influences other elements. So you start to understand what the synergies are and where they interact with each other. With implementation, it talks about both in greenfield and retrofits, basically what's the relative cost of this and how hard, what's political will necessary to make this thing happen. Each element then has a section on recommended approach. This is what we're shooting for. A typical approach. This is what we often see in urban areas throughout the country. Why it's important, and this is where we have mostly peer-reviewed academic literature and then professional best practices, and then a section on background, which talks about for people who are not as familiar with this, some of the basic things you know, for instance, basic things you need to know. So for instance, in this topic, the difference between core and edge habitat, where you might want to buffer, and how different characteristics might impact the amount that you want to buffer. And then each element also has a section called considerations and caveats, which is meant to introduce some of the nuances of these things. So we talk about element interactions, political issues, maintenance or operational issues, and other issues. So trying to give you, as I mentioned, a little bit more nuance. And then finally, the last part is these design guides. So they're guidelines that help you make good decisions in the schematic design phases so that you won't create problems for yourself later on. So you can see example of these pieces here. So as I mentioned, each element in the framework has this chapter like this. So it gives you a way to kind of understand how they're related to each other and more information about each one of them, and then the kinds of things that you should be doing. So I'd like to give an enormous thank you to a lot of different people who helped make this happen. Within this list are a number of professionals who helped us understand, especially areas that I was not as familiar with, professors, people who are working in the field, and students who did a lot of the early research on this work. So enormous thank you, and obviously enormous thank you to Karin Knudsen, who is my co-author in this piece. So I invite you to take a look at the book, and hopefully it's helpful, but also tell us if there's things that don't work so that we can figure out how to improve them for future editions. I'll mention only briefly here that I also do work on, as was mentioned earlier by Lauren, I also direct the Urbanism Next Center, where we look at the impacts of emerging technology on city. So things like shared mobility and self-driving cars and e-commerce, how that affects, we're less interested in the those technology, what we're really interested in is how those things affect land use, urban design, building design, transportation, and real estate. And really the important thing is how those things affect equity, health, the environment, and the economy. So if you're interested, you can go to urbanismnext.org, where we have a lot of this research and this framework. I don't only do frameworks, but this other framework on those topics. And in case you're interested in being in Amsterdam in October, we're holding a conference with, we usually do the conference in the States, but this year we're doing it in Europe. And we're doing that with TU Delft, TNO, and AMS, which is the City of Amsterdam's kind of innovation arm. So invite you to come to that. Also, there's a website if you're interested with lots of information on this. So to sum up, hopefully this is a helpful tool for you. It is really meant not to be prescriptive, but instead to give you a sense of the types of things you need to be thinking about and give you enough information to understand the relationships of each one of these things and what kinds of things you might be doing. After working for more than 10 years on developing this work, I'm super excited now to be getting it into the hands of people who can use it. So I hope it's helpful to you. And I'm also, as Lauren mentioned, I also have a small urban design consulting firm. So if there's interest, I'm also really excited to be helping on specific projects. So with that, maybe I'll stop my share and ask if there's questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nico. That was really great. As somebody who got the opportunity to read the book, it was really awesome just seeing it broken down with all the visuals and the examples at each scale for each topic. So yeah, we have some Q&A questions coming in. I'll just note for our audience that all of these webinars are recorded and will be available within 24 hours of the end of this webinar. You should either receive an email or you can check them out right on our YouTube channel or on our website, cnu.org. So I'm actually going to go right in. We already got some really excellent questions, so I'm going to go through and see what we have. There was this really interesting one that came in pretty early from Vidila, which is most cities are already developed and difficult to change, street networks, infrastructures, etc. What are your thoughts about transitioning towards sustainability and any key considerations?
That is a great question. Thank you for that. First of all, I'll just say that I put in the chat a link to a site that has the framework itself, so you can look at that. I know it's like small text on the screen, and also some sample chapters. To answer the question, yes. So places that are developed are, on the one hand, we'll say harder, but also have a lot of opportunities as well. There's tremendous opportunity, especially in this country, for infill and denser development. So there's enormous opportunities for that. I think most of the development that we'll be seeing, and hopefully that we're seeing, is actually infill development and redevelopment of areas. So there's all sorts of things we can do you might have less opportunity to redo larger scale street networks, but there's huge opportunities to redo street design, density, connectivity, definitely a ton of opportunity to redo stormwater. I think a really good example of that is the city of Portland. City of Portland is leading nationally on stormwater infrastructure, and it's not doing it there's not really new areas of Portland. Portland's kind of bound by cities all around. So within the city itself, there's enormous opportunities to redevelop areas and to shift away from kind of our traditional ways of doing this. Same kind of thing for creating habitat and ecology. Huge opportunities for ecological networks that either exist or need to be strengthened. Daylighting of creeks. So yes, I think enormous amount of need for redevelopment of our urban areas.
Awesome. Yeah, and we had a couple folks kind of chime in for some specific examples on this topic. Does this framework apply to both suburban infill projects and brownfield redevelopments? Yes, absolutely. And as I mentioned before, this is specifically meant to not be prescriptive. And one of the motivations for doing this work is, as I was just starting this and looking for, what are some good guides for sustainable urban design? A lot of guides really put out these fantastic projects like Hammarby Solstad or Vauban, which are just like fantastic, beautiful, everything. I mean, they're addressing almost every topic. And the truth is that
most projects either don't have the political will or the economic ability to do these things, or the we'll say the culture of the place doesn't really lend itself to that. And I think we're in a situation where we can't just say, well, we can only do the most like fantastic, pristine, everything works and everything is dealt with. As I mentioned, as I showed those images earlier with Shanghai and Arizona and Gabon, we need to figure out how we move the dial on every single project. So if we have a if we have a mixed use, dense, multimodal project, fantastic. Hopefully this is a helpful guide for that and can help you fine tune that. If we have a suburban single family home neighborhood, well, there's a ton of stuff that you can be doing, right? That's not well, we don't have density and therefore, well, no, there's a ton of other things that we can be doing. How do we make that as sustainable as possible? And also maybe point to a future that, at some point, this can be redeveloped even more so. So absolutely, yes, all these different contexts.
Wonderful. Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. I think as you've been saying, this is, a framework and we should use it for the context that we are in. And kind of on that same topic, we have a question about, have you used this matrix and handbook to advocate for sustainable solutions in citywide policy regulations? So going back to that political will. And if so, what approaches and arguments have been most effective?
So, well, there's two parts to this answer. On the one hand, so I've not personally used it for like specifically to go after regulations. Again, we've just recently finished this work, so we're really excited to be applying it for such things. But there is Elizabeth McDonald from University of California at Berkeley. Actually, so the framework was built on an article that I published about 10 years ago on kind of proposed this. And she published an article a couple of years later, which overlaid kind of the planning regulatory structures that help make these things happen at these different scales. So I would highly recommend taking a look at that in terms of, okay, well, if this is the physical stuff that needs to happen, what are the regulatory pieces that affect our opportunity to be doing these types of things? I will say I've had really great conversations since the book came out with different groups on how to do exactly what you're talking about. Excellent conversation with the City of New York, a planning department where presented this, and one of the people at the meeting said, well, what we need to do is we need to look at each one of these topics and figure out what regulations we have that are impacting, right, that each one of our opportunity to do these things, figure out where there's things are easy and we can kind of streamline things, and where we really need to do some introspective evaluation of like, well, we need to change these things, right? Because this is not allowing these different things to work. And oftentimes a lot of the problems is actually in the overlaps of some of these topics, right? The synergies between some of these topics. So yeah, that's a yes. I'm hopeful, and I will be working on helping to use these to help change regulations. Yes.
Wonderful. Yeah, the momentum is just starting with this book, I think. We had this really great question from Kimberly Burrows. I'll just kind of read the whole comment. I'm curious why equity is pulled out as a separate outcome goal in the framework, rather than embedded in each part of sustainable urban design. I see the importance of considering who has access and the structures that challenge that. Could you speak to why you made this decision and what are the trade-offs?
Excellent question. And this is like part of like the struggle of putting this book together. And it goes a little bit to the part where I was talking about how each one of the elements kind of talks about how it relates to other elements. Part of the difficulty of sustainable urban design is that it's a complicated topic, and that complexity is sometimes either off-putting to people, and I'll say people being planners, designers, developers, stakeholders, right? Or you kind of like throw your hands up in the air. I can't do anything here. And so part of what we were trying to do is separate specific pieces so that it could be clear, like digestible, understandable chunks of like, oh, this is why this thing's important, and these are the kinds of things I need to do. And then talking about how these things are related to each other. I think the best example of what you're talking about is transportation, right? The entire transportation network and moving towards bike-ped transit is really important for energy reasons. But it's also tremendously important for equity reasons, right? The car is the most expensive way that we can move around our cities. So the idea was to try to separate things out so that we understand them individually, but then really work on making those connections. And I recognize that there's the risk that then equity becomes this other thing, right, that we don't integrate. And I can only say the hope is that that's not how it's used, right? That this is a tool, and then it's up to designers, planners, developers to grab this and make sure that all the pieces are represented within that.
Absolutely. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I will say, just for our audience, we are right at time. It's 1 o'clock Eastern. So if folks have to hop off, just know that this will be recorded and available. There are just a few more questions, and I know I have you for a few more minutes, Nico, so I am going to use them. I have a question as a moderator that I think would be a good time to ask, which is just kind of in the process of doing this whole book, kind of, being involved in this for quite a long time. What advice would you give to designers, planners, and stakeholders when it comes to using this handbook most effectively?
Great question. And I hope people do use it. And if there's ways that you're using it that are helpful, please let me know. If you're ways that you're using it and things that holes you see in it, also please let me know, because we're trying. My goal is to make this is like first draft, and we'll continue to, actually it's like 12th draft, but we'll continue to make this better and better. I'd say, the easiest way to really use the book is really to start with a framework. This is, we were talking about this earlier, Lauren. It's not a book that you're going to like read from beginning to end. It is a book that you should really start with a framework and understand how that works, because that organizes everything. As I mentioned before, as a designer and planner, this is going to help you understand what kind of questions you need to be asking, what the opportunities are, synergies are between these things. You can also use that as an evaluation tool, as I mentioned, again, starting with a framework and then going into the book to figure out much more like what the core information that you need. A big challenge of this book was simply synthesis, taking a whole lot of information and figuring out what's the most important pieces and trying to translate that in a clear, graphically friendly and understandable way. And then also, as I mentioned, with the stakeholders, all right, like starting with goals, using the framework to establish goals, talk about that kind of left-hand side first, and then talk about, well, what's that mean in the built environment? Well, what conditions do we have here? What should we prioritize in terms of the things we need to change? Those types of things.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much for all the work on this. And yeah, I think this will definitely have, maybe a 14th, 15th, 16th draft. And with that, I think we've gotten through the majority of our questions. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and a big thank you for Nico for your wonderful presentation. I really hope folks get a chance to check out the Urban Design Handbook. I highly recommend it. As I said before, a recording will be available. And have a wonderful rest of your day. And thank you again for joining us, Nico.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. And I look forward to hearing from people.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.